The shoulder is a system, and if you think of it as a joint, then you miss the point. In this video, I'm going to explain functional and biomechanical shoulder anatomy by walking you through what happens in a jab, so in a straight lead hand punch from boxing. And in the end, we're going to talk about what that muscle is in the thumbnail and what the significance of it is in shoulder movements, and it's a lot more significant than you think. This gentleman is going to kindly show us how a jab works, and there you can see him extending his arm, hitting the target and bringing it back. Okay, let's do that again. So he extends his arm, hits the target and brings it back. Lovely. Let's talk about the shoulder girdle first. The shoulder girdle is the name for the scapula and the clavicle, and the shoulder joint is the glenohumeral joint. So this is the scapula, and this is the clavicle. This is the glenohumeral joint, or the conventionally thought of as the shoulder joint, and here's the arm bone or the humerus. The reason the shoulder girdle is so important is because it provides a mobile base for the shoulder joint, for the glenohumeral joint. And in a jab, the force production really starts from the lower limbs, so with a little step forward or a lean forward, and that force is transmitted via the lower limbs through the axial skeleton, so through the spine, and then the spine is connected to the rib cage is connected to the sternum to the clavicle, clavicle to the scapula, and scapula to the humerus. And thus the upper limb is connected to the ground. And that's one of the reasons why the shoulder girdle is so important. And there's a joint here which can move, so the scapula can move upwards, so this part of the scapula can rotate upwards like that. There's a scapulothoracic joint, which is sort of a pseudo joint, which means that the scapula can move quite freely along the thoracic cage, the surface of the rib cage. There's an acromioclavicular joint, which which is between the clavicle and the scapula at the acromion, and it allows the scapula to sort of rotate freely off the clavicle, and a glenohumeral joint connects the scapula to the humerus. And let's just visualize what happens in the jab while in terms of the shoulder girdle. So the scapula will be here, the humerus there, the glenohumeral joint there, and the clavicle there. We can't see it, but it will be on the front surface. So let's just think through what happens. So a gentleman is already elevating the clavicle at the front and already starting to protract the scapula. So the medial border of the scapula starts around here, but as the punch progresses, it moves forward. So the scapula is moved forward, and the glenohumeral joint is flexed and abducted, so moved forward and outwards. And that's what happens in the shoulder girdle during a jab. Now we'll talk about the major force-producing muscle of the shoulder, which is the anterior deltoid. And so the deltoid muscle is this bit here. So the shoulder muscle, the thing that makes a man's shoulders look broad. Well, it's that and the interacromial width, but that's probably something for another video. So the deltoid muscle has three heads: anterior, lateral, and posterior. So anterior means front, lateral means side, posterior means back. They're also named the clavicular head, acromial head, and the spinal head or spinal part, based on where they originate from. And the part of the muscle that attaches to a bone that's closer to the midline of the body is the origin, and the part of the muscle that attaches away from the midline is the insertion. So the origin of the anterior head of deltoid is the lateral part of the clavicle, and the insertion is the greater tuberosity. And what it allows it to do is because it crosses the glenohumeral joint at the front, it causes flexion of the glenohumeral joint. And here we see more diagrams of the anterior deltoid. So here's the clavicle. This is again the left shoulder. We're always looking at the left shoulder, and with one exception, but I'll tell you when that is. So here is clavicle, clavicle, clavicle. Okay, anterior deltoid, anterior deltoid, and you can imagine how this muscle, if it pulls in that direction, can cause the humerus to whip out that way, so to flex. Okay, and here we can see the strong flexion action of the anterior deltoid in action, and it's the major contributor to force production at the shoulder in the jab. Next, we can talk about something something that we might call the abduction chain. I'm not sure if that's an official term, but nonetheless, these are again diagrams of the left shoulder, and we can see a few muscles. So this is the trapezius muscle. It's shaped sort of like a kite, and in this diagram, the trapezius has been stripped away, and underneath you can see a muscle called the supraspinatus. The supraspinatus originates from the supraspinous fossa, and it dives underneath the acromion, and it inserts there onto the humerus into something called a greater tubercle. And in this diagram, you can see the insertion more clearly. So this is the supraspinatus muscle, and it inserts there into the greater tubercle. Okay, and what it does is it pulls on this part of the humerus, and because it crosses the glenohumeral joint, it abducts the shoulder, and it initiates shoulder abduction, so glenohumeral joint abduction. Then what happens is, once it's done about 15 degrees of that, then the lateral head of deltoid, or the acromial part of deltoid, originating in the acromion, inserting again in the deltoid tuberosity, continues shoulder abduction until you reach about 90 degrees, at which point the trapezius has to take over. Now, it doesn't always happen quite in that sequence, so there's varying patterns of muscle contraction because real world is messier than the textbooks. But that's in principle how it works. So supraspinatus, lateral deltoid, descending fibers of trapezius. And let's have a look at how that looks. So you can see that the gentleman has already shrugged his shoulder a little bit, and his shoulder is not fully, the elbow is not fully tucked in, so it's a little bit abducted. So probably the descending fibers of trapezius are already a little bit contracted, and the supraspinatus is probably also contracted a little bit. But you can see how the shoulder joint is pushed out further as the elbow is elevated, right? So in this position, you probably have complete contraction of the supraspinatus and of the lateral deltoid, and there's also contraction of the descending fibers of trapezius, causing the scapula to be lifted upwards with it, okay? And this all helps with having a very strong and high range jab. And actually, the trapezius muscle is really active in the jab. Now we can talk about the latissimus dorsi muscle, which may not be a muscle that you were expecting to find in this talk, but I think it's worth mentioning, and I'll tell you why. So the latissimus you can see the spine here. This is the thoracolumbar fascia that attaches to the spine, and from the thoracolumbar fascia originates the latissimus dorsi muscle, and here's a nicer diagram of it, and it curves around the back, comes to the front, and in this diagram we can see the front of the armpit, the lat dorsi has come through there, and it goes into the front of the humerus, and it inserts into a place between the two tubercles of humerus called the intertubercular sulcus. And what it does is it crosses the scapulothoracic joint and the glenohumeral joint. So when this contracts, and you think of the muscle pulling in this direction, and muscles can only pull, they cannot push. So it's pulling in this direction, so it pulls the glenohumeral joint, so adducts the glenohumeral joint, and it pulls the scapula down. And it also internally rotates the shoulder because it's positioned on the anterior surface of the humerus. Why is that relevant? Well, look at this. Notice that even though you've got a lot of contraction of the trapezius and the supraspinatus, no doubt, and the lateral deltoid, the arm only extends this far. The shoulder is only abducted to about 90 degrees. It's not abducted any further. The range of motion of the shoulder is really, really wide, and it can go much further than that, and you can demonstrate that to yourself. So there has to be, there's lots of contraction here, so there has to be something limiting that. And I bet it's lat dorsi. It has to be lat dorsi. It can't be anything else. And you can also notice that the shoulder ends up being internally rotated. That can be done by rotator cuff muscles, but it can also be done by latissimus dorsi. So I bet you that the latissimus dorsi is active in the jab. Now we need to mention a little bit about shoulder stability. So the shoulder is the most mobile joint of the body, but that makes it unstable because there's an inherent trade-off between mobility and stability. I've made a whole video about that. You can watch that as well. Here we have the left scapula and the left humerus, and you can see that this concave surface is where this convex surface will slot into. But you can see that this surface is a lot smaller than this surface, which allows for a broad range of motion, but it makes it unstable. Now there's ligaments around it, but that's not enough. You also need something called the rotator cuff. The rotator cuff is 4 muscles, and they're these muscles here. And these are all, again, diagrams of the left shoulder from the back, from the side. These are from the side, and these are sort of from the front. And the muscles are supraspinatus here, infraspinatus, teres minor, and then we have to go to the anterior surface to find subscapularis. And they all insert around the glenohumeral joint, and what they do is during force production, they pull the humerus inwards, and they pull the head of humerus into the glenoid fossa, meaning that this space, it's this bit is pulled in here really tightly, and that makes it stable. And can you imagine if this gentleman was punching a heavy bag instead? Can you imagine the force he generates in that direction, and the reaction force that it causes on his limb, and the reaction force it causes in his glenoid fossa here, the glenohumeral joint? If it wasn't stabilized by the rotator cuff, that could cause a dislocation. And that's why the rotator cuff is absolutely vital in the jab. Now we can talk about some other muscles that contribute to force production in the jab, and these are the rest of the trapezius, the posterior deltoid, and we have to mention the triceps as well. So the scapula is not just protracted, but it's also retroverted, so the acromion is pulled backwards in relation to the medial border, and that's done by the rest of the trapezius. And the lower fibers, the lower ascending fibers, probably limit what the inferior descending fibers do as well. Then you've got the posterior deltoid, or the spinal part of the deltoid here, which crosses the glenohumeral joint and causes extension of the glenohumeral joint, which is useful towards the end of the punch. And you also have a bit of the long head of triceps, which crosses the shoulder joint here. And this is, again, the left shoulder in the same position as this. And that helps with extension of the shoulder, extension of the glenohumeral joint towards the end. And of course, it also extends the elbow, which completes the jab. And let's have a look at that. So here we go. There we go. The scapula is already protracted and retroverted, so the trapezius is pulling it that way. And if we look at that, there we go. It's just been extended there. The shoulder has been extended, and that completes it. And the elbow has been extended, and that's how the other muscles contribute to movements in the jab. Now it's time to talk about the thumbnail. What's that muscle? If you can name that muscle, great. It is the serratus anterior. The serratus anterior, this is a beautiful diagram of it. This is the right shoulder. All of the other diagrams have been the left shoulder. This is the right shoulder because it's congruent with this image. It originates from the undersurface of the scapula, so the anterior surface and the medial part of the scapula here, and it inserts onto the rib cage, and it looks like a wing, and it's a beautiful muscle if you think about it. And what it does is it pulls the scapula into the rib cage, and it pulls it forward. And what that means is it stabilizes the glenohumeral joint and gives the shoulder a really solid base from which to produce force. And look at this. Can you see how far the scapula has been pulled? And a lot of that has been done by the serratus anterior. And again, the force production here can be really significant. And that is facilitated by the serratus anterior, because without a solid base for the glenohumeral joint, if that wasn't the case, then the maximal force production would simply be reduced. And that is the significance of the serratus anterior in the jab. And the humerus and scapula always move together. They always move together, whether they're moving forward, sideways, backwards, and that's something called the scapulohumeral rhythm. And that is, in a nutshell, why the shoulder is a system and not a joint. And all of these muscles contribute to the dance and the force production that happens at the shoulder in something seemingly as simple as the jab. And there you have it. The functional and biomechanical anatomy of the shoulder explained via the jab. If you enjoyed the video, then please subscribe to the channel and you can receive more videos like this in your feed. And if you think someone else might benefit from it, then please share it with them. My name's Arrow, I'm a doctor in the UK, and I plan on making more anatomy videos from first principles very, very soon. The plan is to upload weekly. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.